Brain injury risk in youth football is one of the most important topics in sports medicine and in fact the entire sports world today. I'd like to talk to you about some of the research that the Stanford Sports Science Institute is doing to advance this discussion. We started performing research back in 2011 with middle school football players. At that time, there was no information available on whether playing one regular season of youth football had any impact on neurologic function of youth football players. At that time, we also had no idea how many times the average youth football player got hit in the head during a single practice, a single game, or over the course of the entire season. That research has continued from 2011 to the present day. In fact, we're gearing up for our season in 2018. This will constitute the longest standing study of youth football players in the United States. The basic experimental approach that we take is we do baseline testing before the season begins using a battery of tests that are commonly used in the clinic to assess for concussion or impairments in neurologic function. We retest those players at the end of the season. During the season itself, we instrument the players with head impact sensors. These impact sensors are placed in the helmets of the football players and allow us to measure the number of impacts, the strength or severity of the impacts, as well as the location of the impacts that the players experience over the course of the season. We tabulate all the data and we look for changes in the preseason scores to their postseason scores as an indication of neurologic impairment. We also look to see if there are correlations between the head impact exposure that they experience over the course of the season and any changes that may be present in those pre to postseason scores. Some of the results that we found is that on average, a middle school football player experiences similar biomechanical forces to their head as what you would expect at the high school level on a hit-by-hit basis. However, there's a big difference in the frequency of impacts that young football players experience. In our middle school population, those players experience about half as many impacts over the course of the season as the typical high school player. Head impact exposure is the cumulative function of both the frequency of impacts, the number of times they get hit in the head, and the severity of those impacts. Since the severity of impacts is nearly the same, but the frequency is half as much, that means that the overall head impact exposure over the course of the season is also about half as much for the typical middle school player as it would be for the high school player. This is very important. A lot of the headlines that have come out recently have shown the risk for long-term brain injury or brain damage suffered by former NFL players or players who have played a number of years at the high school, collegiate, and professional level. It's important to realize that the impact exposure that those players have experienced is far different than the typical youth player. Nearly 70% of all football players in the United States are younger than high school age, and about 98% of all players are at the youth level or the high school level. What that tells us is that even to make it to the college level, much less the professional level, is very unlikely. So using collegiate or NFL players to generalize between what the head impact exposure is that all players experience is simply not the appropriate thing to do. So our research has shown somewhat of a positive message in terms of this risk exposure as measured by head impact exposure being far less in the youth population. One other thing that we found among these middle school football players is that neurologic function through the clinical tests that we use is not impaired from pre to post season. And this is also not related to the number of impacts or the severity of impacts that these players experience. So this is also some encouraging work for people who are really having a hard time deciding whether or not their young child should engage in youth football. We're not seeing that short-term, single season or even 2 seasons of exposure is causing changes in neurologic function. A lot of people wonder, are you studying concussions? And we certainly are in this study. We've had 6 concussions over the 7 years that we've conducted this study, and among those players, they certainly have neurologic impairment after that injury. And it's typically taken them anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 to 5 weeks in order to recover and be cleared for full return to play. So concussions are certainly a serious injury. It's an injury to the brain, and we have to take that seriously, and we have to take steps to reduce the risk of that particular injury. However, there's more to the discussion than just concussions, because all football players are exposed to repetitive head impacts. And that's really where a lot of the shift in attention has been focused, is what happens when players get hit in the head repeatedly over an entire season or over multiple seasons. it's thought that that may be even a stronger indicator or predictor of who may suffer from a long-term injury than just the number of concussions or severity of concussions that players have experienced. This is why we use those head impact sensors, so that we can measure the number of repetitive head impacts, and we can see if the number of impacts and the severity of impacts are in fact related to changes in neurologic function, even if the players haven't suffered a concussion over the course of a season. The best data tells us that about 5 to 10% of youth football players will experience a concussion during the season. But that also means that about 90 to 95% of players aren't getting concussed. Does that mean we don't have to be concerned about them? We really don't know. And that's why we're performing this research. We're really trying to study the effect of these subconcussive impacts and whether they impair neurologic function. Unfortunately, our research isn't going to be able to tell us what happens to these players 20 to 30 years down the road. Those studies need to be done, but we're hoping that through the data set that we're developing, that we can follow these players long term and eventually answer those questions. Unfortunately, though, we don't have the answers today for those parents who, again, are asking the question of whether or not football is too dangerous for my son to play, or what age should I engage him in tackle football. We don't have good answers, but we're looking to science to provide those answers. And through the research that we've been doing at the Sanford Sports Science Institute, we're helping to inform those discussions and educate the public. So I encourage you to follow us and watch through our updates and watch our developments of this research, because we believe it's important work. We believe that it's contributing to that national discussion, and we hope to find answers sooner rather than later.